Rebecca Hayes, a 39-year-old state Supreme Court justice and single mother, faces a shocking betrayal when her own mother testifies at a custody hearing that Rebecca is an unfit parent. Accused of being secretive, unstable, and financially unsound, Rebecca calmly calls an unexpected witness, the Chief Justice, who exposes her true identity, career, and financial stability. Evidence and a court-appointed psychologist vindicate her. The judge grants Rebecca full custody. The story closes with fractured family ties, a cautious reconciliation attempt, and Rebecca's renewed decision to stop hiding who she is. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 3 flattened everything into sharp geometry, hard edges, hard faces. Rebecca Hayes sat at the defense table like a photograph, neat navy blazer, hair pulled back, the pale crescent of a ring on the left hand that didn't belong to her anymore. Around her, the courthouse murmured in ritual rhythms, shoes on marble, a whispered exchange of papers, the small rustle of a child's feet. Tyler sat in the front row, knees swinging, an 8-year-old who thought court was only for grown-ups with grown-up problems. Her mother rose to speak, as if the room were a church. "Your Honor, my daughter has always been unstable," she said. The words landed with a brittle clarity. They were not the tender accusations of a worried parent. They were strategic, laid out in even sentences, each one another brick in a wall. Rebecca felt the vibration of Tyler's fingers in her palm, a small, steady presence she could still feel even as the world rearranged itself. Rebecca had spent her life parsing other people's pain, writing opinions in late hours, listening to victims and parents, carving the law into something that could hold hurting families without crushing them. She had done all that while withholding a truth she thought would shield her son, that she didn't just work at the courthouse, she sat on its highest bench. She'd chosen privacy like armor, believing a simple life would keep Tyler from being reduced to a name on a news crawl, a target for those who would weaponize status. Now that armor was being taken apart piece by piece. Her sister, Karen, sat stone-faced, a folded map of loyalty in her lap. Marcus, who smiled too easily in photos and leaned too close to the camera, watched with a smug, practiced patience. His lawyer's pen kept time, circling the words as if punctuation could bleed truth into being. Accusations came rapid-fire, months gone without notice, odd jobs, a car that squealed, details that painted a portrait of a woman balancing on the edge of chaos. The judge listened with slow neutrality, a learned face that gave nothing away. Rebecca could have risen then and corrected every line of this narrative. She could have given dates and check stubs, explanations and apologies. Instead, she squeezed Tyler's hand and cataloged what mattered. The boy's bewildered look, the way the courtroom's light caught his eyelashes, the pressure in her chest that matched the weight of the oath she'd sworn long ago. This opening scene was not just about facts. It was light against shadow, privacy flipped into mystery, affection into accusation. It was the first motion of the story's axis, family against family, public duty against private love. Rebecca watched the people she once trusted stand in a gallery of betrayals. Each whisper and nod was an arrow aimed at the custody of the small boy who hummed under his breath and pretended to read a coloring book. In that room, paper and testimony would try to remap the contours of a life Rebecca had quietly built, and she, for all her public logic, felt the sudden, raw, human need to respond, not as a justice, but as a mother. She rose. The room shifted like a chorus holding its breath. Rebecca's request to call a witness landed like a pebble dropped into still water. James Crawford's eyes narrowed, Marcus shifted, a small crack in his composed surface. The judge peered over the bench, a crease forming between her brows, a judge's curiosity, careful and dangerous. "State your witness," she said, and Rebecca heard the courtroom inhale. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, not the legal precision so much as the rhythm of it, voice steady, facts lucid, dignity intact. She walked toward the entrance as if crossing from one life into another, and the doors parted like an acknowledgement. A tall man entered, older than most of the faces here, silver at the temples, slow and deliberate. The courtroom's collective temperature changed. Respect has a smell, worn leather, and quiet authority, and that smell filled the air. Chief Justice William Barrett, Rebecca stated. Gasps threaded through the gallery, and Tyler's eyes widened in honest confusion. He had known his mother's bedtime stories and her stacks of papers, but not the name that bent the scales of precedent. He looked at her now as if she had slipped on a new coat and forgotten to mention it. Chief Justice Barrett's testimony was not a parade of glory. He spoke of duties and calendars, of how justice often required seclusion and focus, of opinions written at 2 a.m. when children slept in unrelated houses. He spoke about courtroom ethics like a man describing a sacred geometry. His words traced the shape of Rebecca's hidden life without indulging in spectacle. The effect was clinical, disarming. Behind the legal choreography, more complex things began to show. Rebecca's mother sat small now, the confident cadence gone. There was a tremor in her fingers, nerves, or regret. Rebecca couldn't tell. Marcus leaned forward, jaw tight. On the surface, this was a story of proof, salary numbers, performance evaluations, the crisp paper of public disclosures. On another layer, it was a story about curiosity that had never been asked and pride that had never been celebrated. How many invitations to understand had gone unanswered because Rebecca had thought privacy kinder than pride? In quieter moments between testimony, Rebecca allowed herself memory, nights typing opinions by the glow of a desk lamp, the smell of coffee at dawn when she'd come home after hearings, Tyler's small voice calling "Mom" through a crack in a hotel door. These were not the facts that the courtroom would print. They were the ledger of a life lived at angles, public service folded into the private crease of motherhood. Dr. Sandra Williams, the child psychologist appointed to evaluate Tyler's welfare, offered a soft-spoken counterpoint. She described attachment, routine, the quality of presence, how a parent who is physically unavailable can nevertheless be emotionally attuned. Her notes were clinical but human. Tyler's bond with Rebecca was secure. He showed insight and affection. His confusion stemmed from adults' duplicity more than any parental neglect. As the procedural dance continued, the gallery's murmurs shifted. Friends who'd sat stoic now exchanged glances. Marcus's family, once buoyed, tightened like a net losing air. Rebecca watched not for triumph, but for the precise moment when truth would cleave performance from perception. She felt the familiar legal muscle flex, timing, restraint, then disclosure. She was not doing this to humiliate her mother. She was dismantling a false narrative to protect the small business of a child's life. Outside the room, life was ordinary and unremarkable. A janitor sweeping, a couple arguing softly by the public phone, a courthouse clock clicking inches of time into place. Inside, their small universe had tilted. The witness's words had become the slow turning of a key. Rebecca braced for the door it would open. When Chief Justice Barrett rose to answer the formalities, the gallery seemed to contract, breath held in the muscles of a single body. He looked at Rebecca as he would a colleague, but there was an additional, private respect threaded through his tone. "You are the Honorable Rebecca Hayes," he stated, and the name resonated in the courtroom like a bell struck with intention. Marcus's face lost the last of its color. Her mother's posture collapsed inward, as if someone had folded paper and slipped it from her fingers. But the true pivot wasn't simply a title. It was the slow, deliberate unveiling of context. The Chief Justice described the length and gravity of Rebecca's docket, cases that had kept her away for nights, legal opinions that had reshaped family law precedent, a committee she chaired that enforced ethics. The courtroom readjusted. It had been expecting a clerk and found instead an architect of law. Then came the financial disclosure. Figures felt vulgar in that moment, numbers stripped of their accountant's sheen, but they mattered. Barrett quoted Rebecca's salary, her property holdings, her public filings, a downtown penthouse, a modest mountain retreat, a life materially stable by any measure. Marcus's lawyer, who had spoken with such confidence, flushed and fumbled. The document he tried to find as a countermeasure was not there. Their narrative had no purchase on a record that was public and precise. But the pivot gained its gravity from something smaller, Tyler's voice. The boy who'd been a passive witness until then stood when Rebecca briefly left her seat to gather a piece of paper. He did not stride like a child performing adult roles. He stepped forward with the shaky steadiness of someone chosen to be brave. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" he asked, the question small, but not small enough to be ignored. Rebecca knelt and met him eye to eye. "Because I wanted you to be loved for being my son," she said, and in those words the courtroom found its human terrain again. The exchange punctured the legal armor. It revealed the ethical compromise she'd made, the belief that hiding a truth was protection. For every person who'd applauded secrecy, there was a child now wondering if status was a shield or a cage. The moment was cinematic not because of the spectacle, but because of consequence. Barrett's testimony had toppled the convenient lies about Rebecca's employability and stability, but it also exposed the emotional ripple effects of her decisions. The courtroom was now a mirror in which each player found themselves reflected in unintended ways. A mother reduced to rumor, a father whose assumption had carried him into moral danger, a child learning to reconcile image and intimacy. Marcus, unaccustomed to having his assumptions overturned, made a sudden, vain objection about surprise witnesses. It came out thin and tremulous. The judge's gavel was small, but when it fell it sounded the ending of a chapter. "Sustainable," she said, meaning the witness was allowed, meaning the record would stand. The twist had done more than reveal a career. It forced the characters to contend with their lack of curiosity and their willingness to weaponize ignorance. Rebecca's victory in evidence was clear, but the deeper question hovered like a scent. What is the cost of protecting a child by hiding the truth? Tyler's face answered it in ink, confusion edged with pride. A young person suddenly learning that love and public life could coexist, but not without collateral. Once the official records had been laid bare, the trial shifted into its moral terrain. Papers and public statements had broken the prosecution's surface story. Now Rebecca had to address the subtler architecture of betrayal. Why had her mother believed Marcus? And why had Marcus believed a caricature of his ex-wife rather than the woman he had married? Rebecca chose not theatrical fury. She chose surgical calm. She asked the court to hear the custody evaluation prepared by Dr. Sandra Williams. The psychologist's voice was soft but exact. She spoke of Tyler's attachment patterns, how his play showed a repertoire of secure base behaviors, returning to his mother for comfort and then exploring again. That language, clinical and tender, shifted the conversation from transactional to relational. In the gallery, small reactions multiplied into a chorus. Karen's hands trembled. She folded and unfolded a tissue like someone tracing a fault line. Marcus's family exchanged glances that were less triumphant than stunned. This had not been the neat script they imagined. Marcus himself maintained a poker face, but his jaw worked as if attempting to grind down a new truth. Rebecca watched them and cataloged the patterns she'd seen in courtrooms for years. The defense of public image at the cost of private inquiry. The way narratives hardened when no one simple asked a question. Her mother's testimony, once the spearhead of the attack, had begun to show the softer tissues beneath. Loneliness, a fragile pride that mistook other people's success for a threat. Rebecca had not wanted to humiliate her. She wanted to keep her son's life intact. That intention sat uncomfortably next to the cold fact of a mother's betrayal. Boundaries were not only legal, they were moral and emotional, knotted into family history and the small economies of love. Rebecca called Marcus to the stand. He came forward with a composed gait, the sort that had served him in boardrooms and social circles. Cross-examination is a strange intimacy. She didn't corner him with accusations. She posed precise, quiet questions. Did you ever ask Rebecca what she did at the courthouse? Did you ever read her mail? Were you ever curious about where she spent her long nights? The answers were stammered echoes. She said she worked at the courthouse. I thought she was a clerk, a portrait of willful blindness. The courtroom buzzed with a new accusation, one that cut differently, negligence of curiosity. Marcus had not sought to understand. He had accepted an image that supported his narrative. That omission became as damning as the earlier lies. At the same time, Rebecca felt the compass of her own mistakes. Her secrecy, once intended as a gift, now read like an absence. A child's right to a coherent story of the people around him mattered. She had to own that. Public service carried with it obligations that leaked into private life: transparency, conversation, ritual acknowledgments. She had erred by assuming privacy could contain complexity without consequence. As the hearing progressed, the stakes condensed into a small human promise. What would be the script of Tyler's life going forward? The court's questions were not about prestige, but routine, bedtime, school communication, consistency. Rebecca's answers were concrete: schedules she maintained, caregivers who knew Tyler's rhythms, a stable home with a room painted for him. She spoke with the authority of experience and the tremor of someone whose personal choices had led to unintended harm. Outside, the courthouse clock kept steady rhythm. Inside, small ruptures were being mended and some torn further. The stage was set for a decision that would not only allocate custody, but assign moral weight. Rebecca had borne the burden of secrecy to protect. Now she bore the responsibility of reparation. The courtroom felt smaller as Judge Morrison leaned forward to speak. Her hands were folded like an instrument of balance. She read the custody evaluation, the financial disclosures, the testimony, and the small, tender notes on Tyler's attachment. The sound of the pages turned was the only drum in the room. It measured consequence. Rebecca watched Tyler from the corner of her eye, his expression fragile, raw with the exposure of being the reason everyone had spoken. This was more than a verdict. It was a public adjudication of love. The judge's voice, when it came, was cool and precise. Given the evidence presented and the welfare considerations, this court finds the mother to be the primary custodial parent, she said. Relief washed through Rebecca like cold water. But the movement of the hearing was not clean. When the judge announced supervised visitation for Marcus pending co-parenting classes, Marcus's reaction was not the expected fury. Instead, it was the tightness of a man who had been asked to look inward and been found wanting. He stood, looked at Rebecca, and for the first time in months his face softened with an expression that might have been remorse. Rebecca felt the victory and its strange loneliness. You can be restored in the sight of strangers and still feel the gouge left by those nearest you. Her mother approached with a hesitant step, eyes wet but not yet contrite. "Rebecca, I had no idea," she said. The words were simple. They were not wholly untrue. There had been ignorance, and there had been the seductive force of a narrative that made sense of a life she hadn't understood. Tyler ran into Rebecca's arms the moment the hearing concluded, burying his face in the crook of her shoulder. He whispered, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" For a child, answers were the architecture of trust. For adults, answers mapped the borders of dignity and regret. Rebecca held him and tried to give words that were clean and honest. She spoke of wanting to shield him, of misjudged kindness, of regret. Her voice was both professional and maternal, the hyphen where the two halves of her life met. Outside, the courthouse doors let them into a pale autumn light. Journalists clustered like birds waiting for crumbs. A television van idled with news tickers restless for soundbites. Chief Justice Barrett waited a respectful distance away, his presence a protective, quieting force. For Rebecca, his attendance was not an adornment, but a witness to the consequence of public service on private life. The immediate aftermath was intimate and messy. Marcus, given supervised visitation, would fight to rebuild a role he'd compromised with assumptions. Rebecca's mother, who had testified under oath, offered a letter of apology she could not find the courage to read aloud. There were no cinematic reconciliations, only the small, hard tasks of repair, setting boundaries, reintroducing curiosity, teaching Tyler the truth in manageable pieces. That night, Rebecca sat with a cup of cooling tea, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders like a cloak. She thought of law as a tool, a structure meant to carry human frailty without snapping. She'd used it all her life to protect children and families. Today she had used it to protect her own. But protection had a price: a child who did not fully know his mother's life, a mother whose privacy had been mistaken for neglect. At the end of the day, triumph tasted like responsibility. The court had spoken, but the family would have to learn. Rebecca placed an index card into Tyler's backpack. 2 lines. I am your mother. I am also a judge. Both are true. It was a small, deliberate truth, an opening for conversation, a beginning of transparency she'd been too proud to offer before. Months later, routine settled into a new shape. Marcus completed the co-parenting classes and returned to unsupervised visits, each meeting a slow rehearsal for a relationship neither of them had properly learned. The school play still started at the same time, the bus still hissed at the corner. The ordinary rituals steadied Tyler like a leash against the tide. He learned how to introduce his mother at birthday parties. This is my mom. She is a judge. He said it like a fact and a medal, a phrase he wore with the small, proud gravity of a child who had watched a secret become ordinary. Rebecca discovered something she hadn't expected. Being known did not diminish intimacy, it reshaped it. She began to volunteer for school events she had once avoided, to attend a parent meeting and speak in words simple enough for an 8-year-old's world. She let Tyler see her law books stacked on the kitchen table and explained, in a child's terms, why some nights she had to stay at the courthouse. I help decide what's fair when families are hurting. He accepted the explanation with the quickness of a child's trust. Her mother's letter remained unread in a desk drawer for weeks. Apologies are small instruments that cut deep and sometimes need time to mend. Finally, one evening, they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table, 2 women who had shared decades and secrets and now shared something raw. The conversation was halting, explanations without excuses, memories of a girl who had loved dolls and a woman who had married late and taken a complicated path. There was no easy absolution. There was, however, a reluctant curiosity. Tell me about one of your cases, her mother asked, voice small. Rebecca told a story about a child who had been helped by an order she'd written, simple words, humane consequence. Her mother listened as if hearing a new language. Forgiveness did not arrive as a tidy vow. It arrived as a series of small gestures, a call returned, a photograph sent, a birthday attended. Rebecca didn't erase the past. Instead, she layered it with minutes of mundane tenderness, a loaf of bread bought on purpose, a seat at a school play, a bedtime story with legal metaphors stripped of complexity. Her mother's trust had been scored by a dramatic act. Trust rebuilt itself in small, unflashy increments. Rebecca also adjusted her own armor. She no longer kept everything behind a closed door. She taught Tyler how to ask questions when adult stories didn't make sense. She began to speak about her work with care, balancing the gravity of her position with the ordinary tasks of parenting. Public service and private love didn't collapse into one another, but learned to coexist like parallel lines that occasionally met at important points. The final image is not a perfect reconciliation but a small, steady scene, Rebecca in the kitchen, pouring cereal, Tyler at the table, animatedly planning a school project, her mother humming to herself as she chops apples. Marcus drops Tyler off and lingers, an awkward, human moment of shared responsibility. They exchange practical words about schedules and then part without rancor. Rebecca had been vindicated in court, but vindication was not the end of the lesson. She had learned the cost of secrecy and the power of deliberate revelation. She had learned that integrity requires both public courage and private explanation. In the quiet room of her child's bedtime, she tucked Tyler in, smoothed the blanket, and said, "You are my son, and I am your mother, both true, both whole." He smiled and slept. Outside, the city continued its indifferent orbit. Courts opened and closed, people argued and reconciled, and Rebecca, who had thanked the law for its tools, now had a new one, the courage to be seen.